century of service?
Yeah, it's been a really an interesting ride to just, deal back 100 years and, see how really courageous these individuals were to form the unit and be the first federally recognized National Guard flying unit. So, the story goes, they were sitting in a bar with Garris, Miller, and T. Glenn Harrison, a reporter from St. Paul. And they kind of, etched on a napkin what this formative unit could look like. Because they were paying for, their flying by themselves, and, Miller was a World War I veteran. And so they said, well, we should really get together this summer in 1920, and we should look at, hey, maybe we can, borrow some of the Army stuff and actually do a muster, right? We can get together and do some training, which they did. And they actually had a successful event. Then they kept trying to deal with the War Department, the Militia Bureau, and going, hey, what about these National Guard flying units? And they really weren't getting any traction. So then they thought, well, man, if we can't get somebody to talk to us or listen to our messages, perhaps we need to fly out there. So again, they rented an airplane, and then the Adjutant General, General Rhino, Lieutenant Colonel Garris sat in the front, and then Miller sat in the back, Captain Ray Miller. And they flew a 7-day journey over 1,600 miles in an open-air cockpit to Bowling Field, Washington. And I don't think people can really understand the magnitude of that. Open air, right? So you could smell the exhaust. You could hardly communicate. They talk of trying to, talk to each other that, hey, there's La Crosse or there's Van Wert, Ohio. And they really had a hard time struggling because it was so loud with the wind rush and, just the exposure, right? And there was absolutely zero navigational aids then, right? So they were just flying by roads, the old I fly by roads mentality. But they made it out there, and actually, the true story is Rhino beat Garris and Miller out there because they actually weathered one day in Poughkeepsie, New York. And so he took the train and actually beat him to the militia department, the War Department, the Militia Bureau. And so it was pretty humorous in that regard, but when Miller and Garris then got there, they were met by General Billy Mitchell. And if you know the history of Billy Mitchell, he was a super advocate to make an Air Corps, an Army Air Corps, to have the air part of the Army. And so to a point where he irritated some of the leaders there, and they actually court-martialed him for insubordination. Now, he was later reinstated, but that was the man that they dealt with when they first got there. And Mitchell looked at Miller and said, where did you get those wings from? And he said, well, Love Field, sir, down in Texas. And Mitchell said, well, so did I. And how did you use them? He said, well, I was a pilot in World War I. Well, so was I. And all of a sudden they had this connection. And General Mitchell became an advocate for the Minnesota Air National Guard at that time, and actually made the proposals to federally recognize units so they could actually get funding. And so it's a pretty cool story, and I think some of the undertones are pretty strong too, because when they showed up at first, they said, "Oh yeah, you guys are from Minnesota, huh? We've heard about you guys. You generally get what you want." Or there might be a kind of another side tone, somebody would add into the language and go, well, yeah, we heard you're full of courage and perseverance, and we hope you don't have too much of one and not enough of the other. And so, it just talked to the imagination and grit that the forefathers of the Air Guard had, which is pretty strong, and that's, I think, just speaks well for what we have today as well. Now, I would finish that little story with, man, when they were back home, Garris wrote like a 7-page editorial for what was then the Pioneer Press, or preceded the Pioneer Press, and at the end of it, he goes, this aviation thing is the way of the future, because all you need is a flat field, pasture to land in, a few gallons of gas and some oil, and you're on your way again. And so you think of where aviation came in 100 years is pretty remarkable.
So talking about over those 100 years, that was the beginning of it. He was talking about flying in World War I. Tell me a little bit more about the 133rd, World War II, Korea.
So Camp Ripley played a huge part in preparing the unit. So, you step back a little bit further, the state actually bought 3 hangars, paid $50,000 in like 1922, 23, because they were still running airplanes from 21 and 22. So they didn't get airplanes issued by the War Department yet. So the state of Minnesota coughed in some money out at Minneapolis Speedway here, which is Minneapolis International Airport now. So the Speedway, they ran one race, and all the drivers said, it's so bumpy, we're never going to do this again. So we operated out of the Speedway here for quite a few years until we went over to Holman Field. But I was going to say that the 30s in Camp Ripley really provided the backbone for the flying squadron to become proficient enough to go over to World War II and be successful. So Ripley's a huge part of that history. And over in World War II, then of course after 1941, they started training down in Louisiana, and then they made their way over Membury, England, where they flew the British Spitfire. So they flew that for roughly a year or so, and then they switched to the P-51, the Mustang, and they flew reconnaissance missions. So now they call them ski slides, but they were the unmanned rockets that Hitler had developed, and he was launching them out of northwestern France, onto the English island. And so, the pilots of the 109th had to weave their way through the cloud deck sometimes, find the right altitude where they could actually, bring the bombers in, and then hopefully at the end get down low enough so they could actually have a visual and see the bombing site. But through their perseverance, through their, courageousness, they went and they did. They actually eliminated all those rockets. So they took that threat away from England before the end of the war. Before D-Day, then they started doing the reconnaissance on the beaches, right, to see what was there, where the tactical deception pieces were. There's an interesting story. Some of the maintainers went ahead of D-Day, and there was some engineers that were on shore. They talk about spending time up an apple orchard, and they were made foxholes to live in until the invasion happened. And they thought these are too small, so they borrowed some dynamite from the engineers and blew a hole about 10 by 20 feet, and then they covered it with trees and plant life, and that's where they stayed until the invasion happened and everything rolled past them. And then they went forward and met up with the flying squadron, which then went down into France, in a part of France, and actually operated out of France for the remainder of the war. But I just thought that was kind of a neat part of the story that you don't really hear about that. I guess it's never made the movies, right? But it was written firsthand from an individual that was over there. It's in one of our history books, so I thought it was noteworthy. So yeah, a big part of World War II.
And then World War II kind of led itself right into Korea.
Well, it did. Again, the formative years after World War II, right? So you've got P-51s and, become almost outdated immediately because the fighter jet aircraft came to be. But we did have the F-51s then, and Duluth came into being about 1948, 49. And so we actually teamed up with Duluth and set runway alert over at Volk and operated between Volk and Duluth, just waiting to be deployed. So they did activate both the squadrons, the 109th and the 179th from Duluth. And I think that's another interesting part of the history, the historical structure. There was actually 4 squadrons underneath the group, the 133rd group. And one was from Sioux Falls, one was from Fargo, one was from Duluth, and one was from Minneapolis. So that whole concept lasted up until the 90s almost. It was just with different airplanes, that you would have one group or wing that would supply different squadrons and groups around the country.
So from Korea, you're moving more into modern times. Tell me about those years.
So they struggled trying to get the jet aircraft. And they did finally achieve, getting jet airplanes, the F-89s, and that was really inherited from here. So they were over at Holman Field, and if you go look at the hangar at Holman Field, it's got the 109th Arrowhead on it. And the 109th Arrowhead is representative of the Arrowhead region of Minnesota. And then it's got 34 lights on it, representing the Northern Lights and the 34th Infantry Division, of which we were part of, obviously, being the Army Air Corps. So we moved from Holman, and then we came over here in 1958 in earnest and flew the F-89s. And, it was good, but there was nuclear-tipped warheads on there, right? So after a couple of years, the realization came it's probably not the wisest thing to fly airplanes that seem to crash frequently over a densely populated area. So we should probably fly something with more engines and less armament. And so General Downey at that time, or Colonel Downey, made the decision that, hey, we should go after these C-97 Stratocruisers. So they did. And so they got the C-97, and it's kind of ironic, but there's so many things that happened to the unit in one. So in 1921, it was recognized, right? 1931 was the training up at Ripley. 1941 was the start of the war. 51 was the Korean War. 61 was when we were operational in the C-97. And 71 was the first year we got C-130s. And 91 was the start of Shield and Storm. So you just work your way all the way up to ones. And 2001 obviously is a big date as well, after 9/11. So yeah, and from 71 then with the C-130s, we just moved forward to where we are today, right? Through all the conflicts. So yeah, they've been a workhorse for us for the Cold War, through the total force evolution in the 90s when we were doing a lot of stuff over in the Balkans and Somalia relief efforts. And it's been a busy 20 years, 30 years.
Tell me a little bit more about kind of our modern era, 9/11 and on. What has the unit been doing so far?
So it's almost a blur of activity sometimes. So actually I look back, and unfortunately we lost the historian some years ago. And so we're trying to retrace the history, but I'll give you, we deployed for the first time to the desert in '02, in January of '02 for, it was undisclosed, but it turned out to be a 6-month deployment. which was, I mean, great. I mean, the guys wanted to get into the fight, and they did. And they actually split the unit up then in '03. They went over again. And part of the unit went up to Karshi-Khanabad in Uzbekistan. Part of them stayed back in Ali al-Salim. And at the end of it, some of them went up to Jacobabad, Pakistan. So, I mean, they were all over the countries over there, but that was in support of Operation Anaconda. And so one of the guys that I was talking to said, because Karshi-Khanabad, K2, was an old Soviet base. So there's remnants of all this old Soviet, you know, the airplanes, the tanks, the trucks, scattered throughout the base. And one individual said, well, it wasn't nowhere, but you could clearly see it from there. So yeah, it wasn't a pleasant place to be at all. So yeah, it was busy. I mean, there was, I think, 2003 was the busiest. We flew over 6,000 hours of flight hours. So the guys, they got home in July, and then 2 months later, they were tagged to go out again. So they left in September, went back over to LUD, and served until March of the next year. So that compression was pretty intense. I mean, there was a lot of stuff going on in the early days.
And as commander, you played a role in that. You must have some good stories from your time.
Yeah, there's so many stories. I mean, it's just my time in Afghanistan, was in the end of '06 and '07, and I was the deputy group commander there. It was interesting times. I think, there's one story I would relay. It was during the migration, and we have a lot of troubles with birds flying in and out of there, and we had operating the F-15s and the C-130 simultaneously. And so we were very careful about the birds, doing some damage to an F-15. So anyway, they were coming in, and somebody threw a bunch of frozen hamburger in the burn pit. And of course, when you put frozen hamburger in a burn pit, you kind of get thawed hamburger. And so all these birds that were coming up, migrating in, stopped in the burn pit and filled up with hamburger. And so then after they filled up with hamburger, they went out onto the runway where these little termites were running around for dessert. We could not get them off the runway for like over 2 hours. So we had to stop combat operations because we had birds on the runway. So it was just one of those things. But it was, my first earthquake was felt there. We had our first attack. And I remember during the earthquake sitting in that old Soviet tower going, man, we survived a couple attacks here. We survived, the insurgents, and here this damn earthquake's going to get me in this old Soviet tower as it collapses, because it was rocking back and forth pretty good. So yeah, there was a fair amount of stories. My favorite, I would go back a little bit, and it's from the base here, and I think I have to call it my favorite because I tell it the most, is the Starbase. And Starbase is a school, a DoD-sponsored school on the base, and I used to go and talk to them early on in the days and go through the 4 forces of flight, like lift and drag, and thrust and drag, lift and weight. And at the end of it, you'd always ask the kids, well, have any questions? And this one young man stood up at the end and said, yeah, I do. He says, are you married? And it was an odd question. I've never gotten that one before. And I said, well, I am, but I have to ask, why would you ask? And he said, well, my mom's looking for a dad or a husband, and I think you'd make an all right dad. So I just thought that was kind of a cute story. But that's the kind of touch points that Starbase does. I mean, they really get into the underdeveloped kids in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and give them hope into a STEM education, right? Science, technology, engineering, and math.
You talked about the community a little bit. How important has Minneapolis, St. Paul, the Twin Cities, and Minnesota, how important has that relationship been to the wing?
Oh, it's really an intrinsic relationship, right? I mean, we have to be connected. We are part of the community. We live here. We shop here. We go to church here. We're cared for here, right? So we want to care for the community just like anybody else, right? We want it to be a strong community, and we want to be part of that strength of the community. And I hope as we are ambassadors when we leave the base and we go to foreign lands, that we're ambassadors here as well and throughout the greater Twin Cities area. And we kind of tell the heroics oftentimes of what our guardsmen do when they're out and deployed for the 34th was gone for 22 months? That's heroic. That's a long time. Excuse me. So yeah, I think telling our stories and educating and informing constantly that's part of what we are and what we need to do. And I think there's, the other profound part of that is that being out in the community, we also say, hey, you're getting something for your federal dollar, right? You're not just paying federal taxes for nothing. So there's some people that go, well, it used to be the post office and the IRS are the only things visible, throughout the state. But it's the Guard as well, because there's 69 armories and then the 2 wings. So that's a pretty big presence throughout the state saying, hey, You know, if the road's closed, we'll open an armory. Hey, if you got a flood, we're going to come there and help you clean up the mess or build the dikes. So we're there for you. We're there to protect life and preserve property. And I think that's a big message that we need to continually send throughout the community.
How long did you serve, sir?
I started in '83, finished in '18, so 35 years.
35 years. Looking back, looking out today into the community, if you had to talk to a young person about your career, about their future, about maybe looking at a future in the Guard, what would you tell them?
So there's a couple of things, and it of course depends on the individual, right? So I think there's this very important piece. You know, I struggled sometimes to go, well, why did I have this interest to join the military? You know, the duty, the honor, what was it? What drove you to do that? Truly, I don't think I've figured that out yet. I mean, I'm still struggling with why, but something drew me to it, right? So I think that's the inner piece that, you know, kids have to realize. Why would I do this? You know, why? Why would I go to the military? Of what service could I be? Of what value could I be? I will tell you, there's a purpose-value quotient that is almost unreplaceable, right? Because once you give of yourself for the benefit of others, you own that. Nobody can ever take that away from you. That's pretty powerful. That's service. So I think just starting with the service quotient and going, you know, to serve others is something that is so unique and others just don't necessarily have the opportunity to do it. You will love that the rest of your life. That'll be something that stays with you, and you'll honor that tradition and you'll try to promote it for the future. So, you know, there's this servant leadership, and you know, you hear that word sometimes used loosely, and I don't think you can actually say you've done it until you've felt it. At least I couldn't. So, you know, when you actually, you know, I made this kind of metaphorical thing that, you know, you kind of let the wing and the squadrons grow around you, right? And as they are about to smother you, because that's what you're trying to do, you're trying to grow airmen around you, right? You're trying to make them better. And as if they're about to smother you, if they do, then you should quit. It's time for you to retire. If you rise to the surface, then go on, right? So I think that's kind of how we have to look at it. We need to let others grow around us to the point where they actually smother us. And if they don't, then we move on. If they do, we leave. But that's the service quotient of it too, right? That servant leadership is, you know, you're just an enabler at a certain point, right? You're just enabling other people to be better every day. And I think if you can get that message across that you can become that person, you can actually serve to the benefit of others and feel really, really good about it, it draws people. There's a catch there. There's a powerful catch. So I've always said there's the mental, physical, and the emotional. If you can touch somebody with an emotional touch, that lasts. The mental and the physical touch, yeah, it looks good, sounds good, but that dwindles, right? That wanes. But an emotional touch, if they actually feel it, then they might want to actually join and come and do something that makes them feel good every day. Pardon?
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, thanks. Appreciate the opportunity. So yeah, it's unfortunate we couldn't do the celebration this year, but you know, still 100 years of service to the country and the state, and we're very proud of it as a wing, and look forward to celebrating this thing next year after the COVID is behind us.